As we enter into a period of calm before the storm of the draft, we'll continue to look at what the Vikings might choose to do here on the Eric the Red podcast. Hello and welcome in everyone to the Eric the Red podcast. I am your host, Eric Beck, coming back to you again here for another week, and we're going to jump right into our weekly wrap-up. Now, not a whole lot has been happening, at least not in terms of trades or free agent moves or anything like that for the Vikings, but there have been a few pieces of news that have popped up here. There have been some pieces of speculation, some rumors that have also been popping up here. So let's just go ahead and, I guess, run right down the list of different things that have happened. On Wednesday, it was announced that co-defensive coordinator Andre Patterson will be adding a title to his title. However you want to make that work in your head, but he will also be known now. He has been promoted to the role of assistant head coach. Along with being the assistant head coach now, he will retain his titles of D-line coordinator and co-defensive coordinator roles. So it looks like he is not going to be taking away from anything that he is doing. He is just adding on to his responsibilities. So I'm not entirely sure when it comes to a general public standing or understanding of what happens on the coaching side of the game, what this will mean, what this means for the team moving forward. But it looks like Mike Zimmer has found himself another assistant, someone who he's going to be placing possibly some more trust in terms of game or game development or any sorts of those types of things. And it is especially important, I guess, because Andre Patterson is on the defensive side. So it looks like this may just be another step to continue to attempt to bolster the defensive side of the ball heading into this season. Some other news and notes that happened throughout the week. Michael Pierce, that is, the defensive tackle who signed and then opted out last season, was making media rounds later in the week this past week. Michael Pierce, I don't know if this is technically officially him signing a deal, but this is definitely sort of a second official introduction of Michael Pierce to the Minnesota Vikings fans and to the media here in Minnesota. So Michael Pierce, it sounds like he has had some regrets, I guess, from his standpoint for deciding to opt out last season. I don't know if I have said this before. I think I have, but I don't think you can fault someone for opting out. I think that is possibly a way that I would have leaned were I to be a person who was in that situation, just in terms of not knowing what was going to be happening throughout the season. And quite honestly, with the number of people we saw who got COVID last season in the NFL, I continue to think you cannot knock someone for having opted out last season and trying to maintain their health to the best of their abilities. A couple of other things here. These are some more of that speculation we've been talking about, or that I mentioned off the top of the show. Some places where people are trying to figure out what the Vikings may be attempting to do in terms of a personnel standpoint and what they may be looking to do in the draft. So this week there have been some rumors that pop back up with regards to the Baltimore Ravens' former right tackle who is looking to become a left tackle, Orlando Brown Jr. As it stands, Orlando Brown Jr. still remains with the Ravens. He is entering the last year of his rookie contract, and he is looking to get paid, and he is looking to get moved to a different position. He has played right tackle for the Ravens off and on for the past couple of seasons, and then last season played a little bit at left tackle and feels that he is more of a left tackle than a right tackle. So he has been granted permission by the Ravens to seek a trade and to work out a trade with, I guess, with the help of the Ravens. The Ravens are not just going to do whatever he says, or at least that would be my expectation. But it continues to be seen that the Vikings remain in the rumor mill with regards to Orlando Brown Jr. and whether they may or may not be willing to trade for this player and then potentially start him at left tackle going into this season. As it stands right now, with the players that you have on the roster and players who you may or may not be able to get on your roster, it does not look like the Vikings are going to have a proven commodity starting at left tackle for them this season. Just running down the list of players that they currently have on the roster, you're looking at Ezra Cleveland, who came out of Boise State as a left tackle, Brian O'Neill, who in his final season, I believe, at Pitt was a left tackle and is currently your right tackle, and then Rashad Hill, who is a player you re-signed, who has mostly been used as tackle depth. He has been a backup and has been a solid backup, but has not necessarily been in that starting role for you for an extended period of time. So those are three players who you currently have on your team who you might be looking to move to left tackle. Then we have the questions about, are you going to attempt to trade or possibly actually trade for Orlando Brown Jr., either leading up to or during the draft. And then there are questions about who you might choose with your first selection in the draft. Now, this past week, Mel Kiper Jr. released another version of his mock draft, and in this mock draft, he had Christian Darrisaw, the left tackle out of Virginia Tech, fall to the Vikings at 14. So whether that be an option, whether you end up drafting Christian Darrisaw or Penei Sewell or Rashawn Slater out of Northwestern or Elijah Vera Tucker, who played tackle, I guess, some in college, but is looking to slate in more as a guard in the NFL coming out of USC, or whether it's someone else beyond that in the draft. We've seen the Vikings draft tackles later than the first round in the past, one of those being Brian O'Neill. Or if you're looking to sign or trade for someone else who has not come up in the rumor mill yet. No matter who that player ends up being that you start at left tackle, it, as I said before, does not look like you're going to have a proven commodity at left tackle, or for that fact, at left guard, at least with where we stand right now. So this is all just sort of as there is no movement, and as we are waiting now as we record, we are 12 days away from the open of the NFL draft. We're continuing to have to, I guess, just speculate about what might happen as things move forward. Now, I enjoy the game of speculation. I enjoy the discussions that I have seen around the internet and around the media. But as it stands, I would much rather just know what we're doing, especially since this is, as we have discussed in previous episodes, a position which we have continued to have questions about for at least the last 6 or 7 years. And it continues to baffle a number of people, including me, that you have not attempted to address this yet in free agency, at least, or in the past. I saw a tweet a number of weeks ago that said something to the effect of, you use free agency for present needs and you use the draft for future needs. And as it stands right now, it looks like the Vikings are going to be looking to the draft to solve some present needs. Now, that can work for you, especially with top-level draft picks, or at least that's your expectation of those draft picks. But as it stands, I still remain concerned about what is going to be happening with the offensive line, especially with the holes we have over on the left side of that line. Continuing with some draft rumors, there have been reports that the Vikings have been doing their homework on quarterbacks coming out in this draft. We have seen a number of pro days for top-level quarterbacks here in the draft, guys who are ranked to go in the first round, where the Vikings have had a presence, and not just a presence, they have had general manager Rick Spielman at some of these pro days. Specifically, we've seen Spielman at the Zach Wilson pro day, we've seen him at the Trey Lance pro day, and it is worth noting that those pro days did also have offensive linemen who the Vikings might be interested in, but Rick Spielman nevertheless has made his way to pro days that have included top-level quarterback prospects. Now, as it stands, I don't think there are a whole lot of people who are expecting the Vikings to be looking for a quarterback in the first round, but I do think there are some expectations that the Vikings may be looking to use a mid-round pick on a quarterback. There has been a lot of speculation about Kellen Mond, the quarterback from Texas A&M. There has been speculation about Kyle Trask coming out of Florida. There's been speculation about the quarterback coming out of Stanford, and possibly a couple of other quarterbacks who you may be looking at, or potentially if a quarterback does fall to you in the first round, whether you would be interested in taking that person at that time. Now, as it stands, Kirk Cousins is your quarterback. You have committed to Kirk Cousins. You have a very large financial commitment to him this season and next season. But following that time, he is no longer under contract unless you make a move to re-sign and extend him. As it stands, there are a lot of people in Minnesota, including myself, who are not necessarily happy about the prospect of continuing with the Kirk Cousins experiment and continuing to pay him a lot of money. We would, I think, like to see someone who maybe performs a little better or who makes a lot less in order to fill out some different areas of your team, especially as we continue to harp on the offensive line. So that is some of the draft questions, some draft speculation. Other personnel speculation that we've seen yesterday, that is Friday as we record, Sheldon Richardson, the defensive tackle and former Viking, was released by the Cleveland Browns. That was essentially a swap of sorts as the Browns signed a defensive end in, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name, first overall pick in the draft, Jadeveon Clowney. There we go. There it came back to mind. Browns signed Jadeveon Clowney to a contract and essentially cut Sheldon Richardson, at least it seems, to offset the cost of that signing. So there were questions that came up immediately. Would the Vikings be interested in re-signing Sheldon Richardson to come back and fulfill that role that he had for a season with the Vikings? Richardson, it should be noted, was signed on the same day, or at least brought into the facility on the same day as Kirk Cousins back in 2018. So I think you would have to say that the Vikings have shown interest in defensive players and would certainly have interest in Sheldon Richardson. As we have seen, though, this just continues to be speculation at this point, and we don't actually know what will happen or what the cost would be to bring Richardson in. You do continue to have a little bit of cap space, but whether you actually bring Sheldon Richardson in is yet to be seen. A couple of broader NFL issues that I have awareness about, but not a ton of opinions about at this point. First thing, there have been a number of proposals for rule changes and things of that sort from the owners, from ownership, from different teams. One of those, it sounds like, as was reported yesterday, is going to be shot down, and that is an attempt to replace the onside kick with some sort of a 4th and 15 play in order to regain possession in the way that the onside kick used to be used. This has been a point of conversation in recent years because with different rule changes on kickoffs, it has become harder and harder, more difficult and more difficult to actually recover an onside kick and to actually have that as a tool to regain possession when you are behind, when you are trailing there. Well, at any point in the game, I guess you could use it, but especially when you are trailing in the fourth quarter. So the 4th and 15 type of play is an attempt to put in some sort of similarly difficult play, which would allow you to retain possession or regain possession of the ball late in the game. And as we said here, that the report coming out is that is unlikely to pass. This is not the first time this has been put to a vote amongst NFL owners, and this is also not the first time this has not been accepted. My interest in this, I would love for the onside kick to continue to remain viable, but it definitely doesn't seem like that is going to really ultimately be an option. So considering what you might want to replace that with, if you were to replace it, what would be the sort of option that you might want to actually put into place? Now, I think my understanding of what this 4th and 15 play is that you would set the ball up basically on the same sort of yard line, which at the moment is the 35, where you would be kicking off from, and then have a 4th and 15 play, which if you convert, you retain possession of the ball, and if you don't convert, then possession goes to the opposing team. I don't necessarily know that is the best option just in that sort of a that's sort of a style of play, because that begs the question, are you able to just push the ball immediately down the field on that play? Could you possibly potentially score on that play? Is that going to be a different sort of probability, I guess, especially depending on which team you have attempting those plays? As it stands, different teams are going to have different probabilities on the onside kick play, but it seems like the 4th and 15 play may have an even larger disparity if it is utilized by different teams. So one suggestion I heard was running some sort of a one down play from the 15-yard line into the end zone. And if you were able to convert on a play into the end zone, then you regain or retain possession at some yard line, be it the 35 or the 20 or whatever, and then begin another drive from that point. That is something I think sounds at least relatively interesting. Whether something like that would potentially be offered up as a rule change in the future, I'm not sure. But I do have interest in finding some sort of higher probability play than what the onside kick currently offers in order to attempt to give a team another possession of the ball. Ultimately, all of this, any rule change or anything like that, is going to change the game in some way, shape, or form. But we have seen throughout the years that we already have been changing the game in some way, shape, or form to attempt to have some sort of different, whether it be a probability type thing in terms of what the way plays go, and attempting to address player safety on the field and anything revolving around that, or any other number of things that have resulted in rule changes in the past. The way that the game changes, the game year to year slowly changes to a thing that we haven't seen in the past. So I am not opposed to something just because it would change the way the game is played, because we have already seen things like that happen. That said, I am completely and totally against removing kicking at all from the game. I know there are a lot of different ways that the NFL has changed rules to attempt to make things safer on plays where kicking is happening, but I think that is a skill that needs to remain in the game, and ultimately it is one of my favorite parts of NFL football, is the kicking game. The specialists, both punters and kickers, kickoffs, field goals, all those different types of things. I think it is essential to the game of football as it is played, whether that be today or in the past or moving forward. So I'm not for completely removing kicking from the game of football in the NFL. I am for attempting to find some sort of replacement for the onside kick if it allows for, especially if it allows for more excitement, or maybe it's just because the Vikings spend so much time behind or trailing that I want them to have as many chances as possible to attempt to win the game and to amend for previous mistakes in games. So that is definitely a possibility. Other things that are happening, let's go down the list here. It sounds like there are a lot of movements from players with different teams attempting to sit out of voluntary team workouts, and that we're seeing entire teams agree to this, entire teams from the player standpoint, that is. Now, I don't have a huge understanding about this. It does seem like voluntary workouts, just by their name, are voluntary, but typically are more often than not attended by the entire team, or at least a vast majority of the team. I don't know if this is a COVID thing. I don't know if this is a different sort of player safety type thing. I ultimately have no opinion at the moment, but I do want to acknowledge that it is something that is being discussed in the NFL. I am not sure. I have not seen whether that has reached the Vikings or not, but it has reached a number of teams across the league. Another thing that I saw this week come across the board was that there is now an official partnership between the NFL and a number of different sports books for betting legally on sports. I don't have a major opinion on this either. Personally, I am not a gambler. I do not enjoy gambling. I would much rather feel like I have more control than gambling offers. This is the reason I don't play fantasy football either. I just don't like not having control or not feeling like I have control. So I don't have an opinion per se. I feel like if you're going to introduce gambling into the NFL world, I would love for it not to completely take over the world, to completely take over telecasts, because I know if the NFL is attempting to make even more money off of gambling, this is going to become pervasive across the NFL and across all of NFL media. So I would much rather see that downplayed as an issue, I guess. I also want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people who may have issues with gambling in terms of their own personal addiction, and so it would be great if that is not a thing that was pushed further ahead in terms of more people becoming addicted to something like that. So those are my, I guess, lack of opinions on those different issues. The final thing we'll touch on here in the weekly wrap up is that going to that gambling aspect, betting odds have been placed in terms of an over under for win total for each of the NFL teams over the past week. And the number that came across for the Vikings now in this new 17-game season is that the Vikings over-under win total was set at 8.5 games. That means essentially if you were to take out any opportunity for a tie, you would either be betting that the Vikings are winning 9 or more games or 8 or less games. As it stands, I think that's a relatively fair understanding of where the Vikings might be headed this season. We're going to have to wait and see once an NFL schedule is officially released where the Vikings will be going when and who they will be playing when. As it stands, just looking at their teams that they will be playing this season without knowing when they will be playing them, my guess, I guess, at the moment is that you're looking at the Vikings. This is going to be a very wide range, but you're looking at the Vikings either being a 6-win or better team or a 12-win or worse team. So I think the Vikings, as it stands, have the chance to win anywhere from 6 to 12 games. That obviously is a very large range. But going into last season, I feel like it was a similar sort of range for me. And then you ultimately saw the Vikings end up going 7-9 last season. The Vikings over the last 3 seasons have won 8, 10, and 7 games respectively. So all 3 of those end up falling inside of that range as well. It's going to depend a lot on how you are able to integrate the new players you have brought into the team, how you are going to draft, how people are able to maintain and sustain their season and sort of avoid injuries as much as possible. Injuries certainly played a large role for the Vikings last season, especially on defense. And so there's a whole lot left to be said in terms of what may or may not be happening. But with that 8.5 over-under being set by whoever the odds makers are, I don't really have an issue with that number. I think it's certainly... We don't know who the Vikings are going to be this year yet. We have no idea. The Vikings we're just going to, I guess, have to, once again, wait and see what happens game to game in order to actually find out what happens game to game. So I think 8.5 is a decent over-under. If you were to force me right now, I would have to actually look at who the Vikings are playing. So if we can take some time for me to vamp as I pull up the Vikings opponents for 2021, we'll go ahead and do that, not up on the screen, but at least on my screen. And we'll take a look at who the Vikings are playing. I know that I have covered this, or I'm pretty sure I've covered this in a previous episode, so if I'm retreading old ground, I am sorry for that, for those of you who may or may not be regular listeners, but we're going to go ahead and do that anyways. So, home games for the Vikings. We know that the Vikings will be playing these teams at home. The Bears, the Packers, the Lions, the Steelers, the Browns, the Rams, the Seahawks, and the Cowboys. Now, last season, the Vikings only won one division game, that is, at home. They beat probably the Lions. I think it was the Lions at home. And then you're looking at with the NFC North and the NFC West and the AFC North coming to town. You're looking at difficult games coming into US Bank Stadium. With the Steelers and Browns, that is very easily, I feel like, a possibility that you could lose either of those games. As it stands right now, I am actually probably more concerned about the Browns than the Steelers, depending on, I guess, when you get them in the season. I would be more concerned about the Steelers with an earlier game of the season. With a later game of the season, I think you might have a better shot of beating the Steelers at home. The Rams are looking to improve this season, and the Seahawks are always difficult. It's kind of amazing that we actually get to play the Seahawks at home this year, because it seems like every time we play the Seahawks, it's in Seattle. So that is... It's going to be beneficial, I guess, to have them at US Bank Stadium and probably, potentially, actually having fans at home games this season. So you're hoping that it'll give you a better shot. But that said, those two NFC West teams, it's going to be difficult to get wins out of those games at home. And then you have the Cowboys at home. The Cowboys were a mess last year. The Cowboys probably will continue to be a mess this year, but you still managed to lose your game against the Cowboys last season when I do believe you played them at home. So I have concerns with basically every game on this, but I think ultimately you're looking at anywhere from expectations 3 to 6 wins at home, which puts you on track for that 6 to 12 win mark during the season. Looking at games where you will be the away team, you're going, of course, to Chicago, to Green Bay, and to Detroit to play the Bears, Packers, and Lions, respectively. Your other road games are the Bengals, the Ravens, the 49ers, the Cardinals, the Panthers, and the Chargers. I do feel a little better about the teams you're playing away from home this season. The Vikings actually did end up winning all 3 of their division road games last season, sort of surprisingly, especially with that the game against the Packers coming off the bye last year. This season, I would be hard-pressed to say you're going to win all 3 of your division games on the road again. It is always difficult to play at Soldier Field. It's always difficult to play at Lambeau Field, especially depending on when you have to play there. If you have to play there in the winter, it gets even harder. The Bengals, I feel like that is a game that you should win even if you are on the road. The Ravens is going to be a very difficult game. The 49ers, we're not entirely sure who the 49ers are going to be this season, so I guess the jury is still out on that. The Cardinals, I think that might actually be the same thing. It is shaping up, in my opinion, for the NFC West to be one of the best divisions in football. Of course, we'll have to wait and see. That prediction has been made about many a division at many a time in the history of the NFL and has not always been accurate. And then you're looking at the Panthers and the Chargers on the road. I think the Panthers have the possibility to once again be a mess, but you did just barely beat them at home last season. And then the Chargers, it seems like they might be an up-and-coming franchise at the moment, so we'll have to wait and see about that. But looking at the road lineup again, I think you're looking at anywhere from 3 to 6 wins, which once again puts you at 6 wins on the low end for the season and 12 wins on the high end for the season. But we were pushing me to make a decision about an actual win total and whether I would choose an over or an under for this season at 8.5. So let's go ahead and pick what I think this might be. I am going to say losing to the Browns at home, losing to the Seahawks and Rams at home. Let's say the Vikings get 4 wins at home, and let's say they lose to the Pack and to Chicago on the road, lose to the Ravens rather on the road. I'm going to take the under right now. I honestly am. We'll wait and see what happens in the draft, but I'm going to say the Vikings I'm going to put them at 8 wins with what we know right now. I reserve the opportunity to amend my decision. This is very much a snap decision, but I think 8 wins puts them under 500. I'm going to put them at under 500 on the season with where this stands. Waiting to reserve ultimate final prediction judgment for when an actual schedule comes out and when the actual team is more well-defined. This may ultimately end up waiting until just before the season begins. But pressing me right now, I'm going to say take the under on 8.5, but I don't feel comfortable about it. So, with all that said, I think that is going to end our weekly wrap-up, and we're going to go ahead and jump into, after the break, continuing the trend of looking at these previous drafts that the Vikings have made. This week, we will be looking at the 2018 and 2019 drafts, so go ahead and prepare yourselves for that on the other side of the break, here on the Eric the Red podcast. Hey everyone, this is the point in most podcasts where you would maybe expect to hear an ad read, a Patreon plug, or something of that nature. While that may be something that ends up being integrated into this podcast in the future, I'm more concerned at the moment with getting this podcast up and running. So, no ads, no Patreon, but if you do want to find out more about this podcast or any other project I'm involved in, head over to ericbeckmedia.com. That's ericbeckmedia, all one word, .com. Now back to the show. All right, and we are back here on the Eric the Red podcast. Now, we're once again screen recording on my computer, so let's go ahead and get this all set up, and we'll go ahead and pull this up on the screen for those of you watching on YouTube. I can already tell that my computer is having to work harder than it normally does for this, so I'm really hoping that the screen recording continues to work for us as we keep looking at these different drafts. So let's go ahead. We're going to start off looking at the 2017 Vikings roster and seeing what happened there. 2017, of course, is the season where the Vikings last went to the NFC Championship game. And coming out of the 2017 season, the Vikings felt like they were in a win-now window. They felt like they were in a Super Bowl window, and they felt like they were one piece away from that, and that the piece they were looking for was the quarterback. So in the 2017-2018 offseason, the Vikings, or I should say the offseason after the 2017 season, the Vikings signed Kirk Cousins to a 3-year fully guaranteed deal. And as we mentioned earlier in the show, they also signed Sheldon Richardson to come in at defensive tackle and paired Sheldon Richardson with Linval Joseph on that defensive line. So as we're looking at who the Vikings might be interested in drafting, what positions they might be interested in drafting, we are continuing once again to look at the offensive line, as it looks like only one player on the offensive line managed to start all 16 games for you in 2017. So you're continuing to look for stability on the offensive line. We also had Dalvin Cook get injured, so we see that Latavius Murray was in there for 17 games started. As it was, there was an expectation that Dalvin Cook would be coming back for you, and that other players at skill positions would be coming back for you. And I think we're starting to know that Laquan Treadwell is turning into a bust at this point, so you maybe would be interested in looking at a wide receiver. And then, as always, I guess on the defensive side, you're looking for depth. It is worth noting here in the 2017 roster that this is sort of set up as your base roster, or your base defensive roster, actually being a nickel roster. You only see 2 linebackers listed here on Pro Football Reference for the Vikings starters, and that's Anthony Barr and Eric Kendricks. So you would maybe be interested in some way bringing in a linebacker if possible, or trying to sort of solidify your defensive back end and trying to find some more people to come in on the defensive backfield or in the defensive backfield. You're also, I guess, as always, sort of considering what are you potentially doing with your specialists in terms of your special teams players. So let's go ahead and jump into this. We're looking here at the 2018 NFL Draft, and we're looking for the Vikings' first pick. And since the Vikings finished in as losers in their conference championship game, they ended up with a very late pick in the first round. And as we scroll down, we see that the Vikings took 30th overall, Mike Hughes, a cornerback. So this would be one of those places where you're seeing the Vikings looking for defensive backfield depth. Said that poorly, and that was more of a tongue twister than it needed to be, but that's what the Vikings were attempting to do there. As it has turned out, even though Mike Hughes looked like he was going to be the man after having an interception in the first game of his career, ultimately Mike Hughes has had significant injury issues playing for this team, and it looks like the Vikings may end up moving on from Mike Hughes at the end of this season at the very latest. It looks like the Vikings will not be picking up Mike Hughes' 5th-year option for his coming off his rookie deal. As it stands, Mike Hughes, it looks like, is going to be considered a miss from this draft. And as you're looking at other players who you might have been interested in taking, we see 2 picks after Mike Hughes that Lamar Jackson was drafted by the Baltimore Ravens. This is a pick that I will continue to harp on time after time after time. When people say the best option going into 2018 was taking Kirk Cousins or signing Kirk Cousins. I don't think that's possible when you have Lamar Jackson, who was available to you and you could have taken 30th overall. That being said, in the same breath, I have to say that I don't think the Vikings would have changed their offense in order to most greatly utilize Lamar Jackson's gifts as a mobile quarterback. I think the Ravens maybe did the best possible thing they could have done, which was change their offense in order to more proactively suit their quarterback. So even though Lamar Jackson is now an MVP, a former MVP in the NFL, I don't know that you would have gotten that same sort of performance out of him here in Minnesota unless you had been willing to drastically change your offense, which, as 2018 showed us, the Vikings were not willing to do. Now, another player who you might have been interested in and who would have fit a need for you is a couple picks after that. Early in the second round, we see the Colts drafting Darius Leonard. Darius Leonard, as we see here, is a Pro Bowler. He's been a very good linebacker for the Indianapolis Colts, and I think is someone who you would have liked to have taken in place of Mike Hughes. So those are, I should say, two different players who I think would have been a better choice at 30th overall than Mike Hughes, and who history has shown us would have been better options. Now, it is worth saying before we continue here into the second round and further into this draft, as we get closer to the present day, we are going to have less and less in terms of just gameplay and potential possible starting play or play in general for these draft picks. So we're going to be running on less information as we move forward in trying to evaluate these picks. This is probably the last season where we have really sort of the best amount of information available to really sort of analyze who has and has not worked or hasn't worked, however that works in English, for the Vikings. But I think it's fair to say that we know sort of how Mike Hughes has played out as a member of the Vikings. Scrolling further down in the second round, we see that the Vikings here in the second round took a tackle out of Pittsburgh by the name of Brian O'Neill. This, I think, is going to be shown as probably the best pick that is of this draft for the Vikings. Now, Brian O'Neill has not yet been a Pro Bowler for the Vikings, but he has served as a solid right tackle for you, as a solid option for you on that offensive line, which has been incredibly transitory, or whatever the proper word is in terms of not being solid, sustainable starters for you on the offensive line. Brian O'Neill has proved to be very good for you, even if it hasn't been at a Pro Bowl level yet, and he will be looking for a new contract after this season, or possibly hoping to sign that contract before the season begins to remain on the offensive line for you, remain as a solid option for you. Whether that is at left tackle or right tackle, of course, has yet to be seen, but this certainly looks like it is a very good pick for you. It is worth noting here that the 49ers drafted Fred Warner within 10 picks of Brian O'Neill after the fact, so that is another linebacker who you could have drafted. It is also worth noting as we scroll down here into the third round that Orlando Brown Jr., who is someone who you may potentially be trading for or looking to trade for this offseason, was available for you in the third round. Now, I am not saying that either of those players you should have drafted, but I am saying that they are potentially people who you could have drafted in that second round slot. The Vikings traded out of their third round pick, traded that to Tampa Bay, and it looks like they traded for a fourth and sixth round selection. I don't know necessarily that there are people who you were looking at with that pick. It doesn't look like there was a ton of action. And then you ended up having that fourth round pick a couple of picks later, which you traded for with Tampa. And with that pick, you took Jalen Holmes, who was a defensive end. Jalen Holmes apparently has been a depth guy for you on the defensive line, but has not turned into really a starter in any sort of sense. It's also worth noting here that Mason Cole, who you just traded for with Arizona, was drafted in between when you would have drafted in the third round and when you ended up actually drafting in the fourth round. Not much to say other than just noticing his name popping up there. And not a whole lot there is impressing me with Jalen Holmes. Later in the fourth round, this pick you would have had, you traded to the Philadelphia Eagles for Sam Bradford. So this is sort of the continuing legacy of the Sam Bradford era in Minnesota. And Bradford, of course, did not really last that long for you. but I don't think you can fault the Vikings with making that trade with where they thought they were going in 2016 and with where you hoped you would be able to go with Sam Bradford in 2017 before he ended up getting hurt. Further down the line, 5th round, once again, another tight end, just like the Vikings always love to do, taking a tight end here in the middle of the draft, taking Tyler Conklin. Tyler Conklin at the moment is your option as your number 2 tight end coming into this season. So whether you end up finding another tight end or not, it looks like Tyler Conklin is going to be seeing some significant playing time for you. And as it stands, I think the jury is still out on this one as well. I don't know if you can fully grade Tyler Conklin. I think he may be doing better than you would have hoped, especially now that you're looking to slot him in at the tight end 2 position. And he showed a couple of flashes last season, I think, in terms of being able to catch the ball for you. So maybe you're hoping for Tyler Conklin to turn in, as he was nicknamed by some people, Tyler Gronklin for you this season. Moving further down in the 5th round, we see the Vikings once again drafting a kicker, and this was a kicker by the name of Daniel Carlson. Daniel Carlson survived for 2 games for the Vikings and then was cut after a very poor performance at Lambeau Field in the second week of the 2018 season. After being cut by the Vikings, Daniel Carlson took some time away from the sport, at least for a number of weeks, and then found himself landing with the Oakland Raiders, where he has been I will say, solid kicker for the Raiders. Was it a hasty decision to move on from Daniel Carlson? I don't know for sure. What I will say about Daniel Carlson being cut at the time is that reports came out that Carlson, it seemed like, was unwilling to respond to coaching and was unwilling to change how he was approaching his kicks until after he was cut by the Vikings. I don't know whether that says more about Daniel Carlson as a young player, or whether that says more about you with the Vikings and your coaching staff. The special teams coach at the time was still Mike Prefer. This was just before he left to go to Cleveland to fulfill the same role in Cleveland. I think we saw some different issues with Mike Prefer throughout his tenure with the Vikings. But I don't know what to say about who, quote unquote, whose fault this was in terms of Daniel Carlson not working out for you in Minnesota. As it works out, Daniel Carlson did not work out for you in Minnesota. And I have continued to point out week after week after week of us doing this, different kickers who were available as undrafted free agents who you could have taken. One of those, of course, being Justin Tucker with the Ravens, who is shaping up to be one of the best kickers that has ever been seen in the NFL, and you missed on him. I have some frustration with the way the Vikings special teams has been played in the past, if you have not noticed. Moving on down to the 6th round, we see the Vikings have 2 picks here in the 6th round, made a bunch of different trades. The Vikings in this draft actually had the most picks out of any team in the draft. They had 12 picks in this draft. 2 of them here in the 6th round, an offensive guard by the name of Colby Gossett out of Appalachian State, and Ade Aruna out of Tulane as a defensive end. I don't recognize either of these names, so I'm pretty sure it's fair to say that they did not really pan out for you. Moving further down the list, we have Devontae Downs, a linebacker for you. There are a couple of picks that we're going to be seeing here that the Vikings had and then traded and then got back. This 7th round pick, Devontae Downs, is one of those. No other comment other than I think it's funny. So Devontae Downs, they're drafted. One notable player here in the 7th round, who the only reason I know about him is because of some NFL media stuff, Jordan Mailata, who was a tackle for the Eagles, was a professional rugby player before he was drafted in the NFL. So nothing else to say there other than sort of an interesting situation for him. So the Vikings ended up only having one 7th round pick in this draft, which is sort of against the norm for what we have seen in their draft philosophy in the past. But ultimately only ended up taking Devontae Downs. I don't have much to say about Devontae Downs either. I recognize the name, but that is about it. Scrolling down into the undrafted free agent list, we see a couple different names who sort of are known around the league, most notably perhaps as Philip Lindsay with the Denver Broncos. But the three notable Vikings undrafted free agents out of the 2018 draft were Holton Hill, Mike Boone, and Chad Beebe. Now, as it stands, only one of those players is still with you, Chad Beebe, who re-signed coming out of this offseason. Mike Boone has moved on to Denver. Holton Hill, I don't know what the plans are with Holton Hill. As it stands, these are three players who provided decent enough depth for you that I guess it was worth them showing up on this undrafted free agent list for being a notable undrafted free agent. I think they all sort of have served their own purposes in their own ways. They've provided, again, decent enough depth, decent enough to the point where it was fine having them as undrafted free agents, and then we will be moving on from them, from two of them at least earlier on, and then one of them eventually be moving on from them. But certainly not to the level of Adam Thielen as an undrafted free agent, and probably not even to the level of someone like C.J. Ham, who you got as an undrafted free agent. So, having gone through this now, we're going to look over this list. Oh, this actually was not the 12 pick draft. That will be 2019 that we look at. This is actually relatively small compared to what we would maybe expect from the Vikings in terms of the number of players they drafted. But looking over this list, we see first rounder Mike Hughes, second round Brian O'Neill, fourth round Jalen Holmes, fifth round Tyler Conklin and Daniel Carlson, sixth round Colby Gossett and Ade Aruna, and seventh round Devontae Downs. Out of this, I think we mentioned during going over this draft, Brian O'Neill, in my opinion, is your best selection there. And then I think your second best selection is probably actually Tyler Conklin. Just considering how Mike Hughes' career has played out, I think that's working more as a miss for you than as a hit. I think Tyler Conklin is more of a hit than Mike Hughes was. And then ultimately looking across this draft, it's hard to say that it was a very successful draft. There was news that came out earlier this week, or I should say there were draft general manager rankings that came out this week. And it had the Vikings general manager Rick Spielman ranked at number 6 among general managers in the draft in terms of a power ranking standpoint. There are drafts like this one that make me question that ranking. I don't know whether that number 6 is more because of the prowess of Rick Spielman or more because of the ineptitude of all the other general managers on the draft, and with the number of different new general managers you may be seeing coming into this draft. But it's fair to say that, as we discussed in a previous episode, Rick Spielman's best draft in terms of the Zimmer-Spielman era was probably 2015, and we've sort of been doing the best we can to chase those types of results in the draft since then. So, having looked at the 2018 draft, let's go ahead and look at the 2018 Vikings roster to see what happened and what we might be looking for moving forward into the 2019 draft. The Vikings finished 8-7-1 in 2018 and ultimately ended up missing the playoffs after losing a game to the Bears there at the end of the season. Looking now at what the Vikings might be looking for, we again see Dalvin Cook was not playing for the entirety of the season. Diggs missed a couple of games, but still looks like your skill position players, except for Laquan Treadwell, were working out relatively well for you. Offensive line, once again, we only have one player who was able to be on the field for all 16 games. One of these in the terms of Brian O'Neill, I don't think that's necessarily his fault. Brian O'Neill started in the middle of the season at a point when the Vikings did not expect him to be able to perform as a starter, and then ultimately ended up surprising the team and a whole lot of other people in terms of actually being able to fill in at right tackle and then do a good enough job to win that spot moving forward throughout the next few seasons. Looking on defense, this defense underperformed pretty significantly in terms of what they had done a season before, and I think there were a lot of questions coming out of 2018 as to what Mike Zimmer was doing in terms of a defensive scheme, in terms of coaching this team. Because there was a lot made about the loss that happened in Philadelphia and ultimately really the last 6 quarters of play in the playoffs for the Vikings in 2017. And it seemed like the defense that Mike Zimmer had worked out in 2017, which had been so dominant during the regular season, had been quote-unquote figured out by teams in the playoffs. And so Zimmer was trying, perhaps more than necessary, to make a bunch of drastic changes all at once that did not benefit the defense. So looking at this team, there were, I would say, a decent number of pretty good players for you on defense, but it just didn't work out performance-wise for you. So looking at who you would be interested in drafting, once again, we're looking at offensive line. And then we're looking at the defense. Sheldon Richardson, I believe, only ended up working with the Vikings for 1 season. And then you're looking at some players getting older on the defensive line in Linval Joseph and Everson Griffin. And then I guess, as always, you're looking for defensive backfield depth. So let's go ahead and jump into the 2019 season, where the Vikings had 12 selections. And this was actually the very heavy draft for them. With their first pick, Minnesota Vikings selected Garrett Bradbury as a center. I've been using the phrase jury is still out on players, and that once again applies to Garrett Bradbury. We don't really know whether Garrett Bradbury is trending towards bust or has just been having issues around him with the rest of the offensive line. As it works out, it does seem like Garrett Bradbury is not going to be the star stud center that you hoped he would be, drafting him in the first round. In terms of players you might have been interested in, this is where we're starting to see the impact of these drafts being closer and closer to the present day. You're not necessarily seeing which players have developed into the top level players that you will maybe see them be later on in their careers. That said, there was a center drafted in the second round by the Green Bay Packers by the name of, I'm doing this to myself again, Elgton Jenkins. I gotta look at these names before I actually do them. But in any case, this was a Pro Bowl center for the Green Bay Packers. So it looks like you may have missed once again on a player at a position which you drafted where there was a better player available to you at a different point in the draft. Moving on to the Vikings' second round selection, the Vikings drafted Irv Smith Jr. At the moment, Irv Smith Jr. is more hype than production. We have every expectation that Irv Smith Jr. has the ability to develop into a very good receiving tight end. We have not yet seen that happen, and it has yet to be seen whether that is because of the player or because of how the player has been used so far. As it stands right now, this season, Irv Smith has the opportunity to jump into the tight end 1 role as Kyle Rudolph departed the team, was cut before the free agency period opened. So Irv Smith Jr. has the option, or has the ability now, to jump into that starting role, and we will see whether Irv Smith Jr. actually is able to pan out for you as a good starting tight end. As it stands, after this draft spot, we see 3 different Pro Bowl wide receivers drafted after the fact: A.J. Brown, Mecole Hardman, and DK Metcalf. At the moment, I'm going to say at the moment, I think these players have shown better production than Irv Smith Jr. has, but once again, it has yet to be seen whether that is because of the player or how the player has been used. But it is worth noting those 3 Pro Bowl wide receivers. Scrolling down into the third round here, we see the Vikings trading a ton. We see 4 different trades that the Vikings made, just basically accumulating picks, I guess, and moving back in the draft in order to accumulate picks. I'm going to touch on here, since we have these 4 freaking trades made in the third round by the Vikings. There is a draft philosophy that is pushed in the NFL where there is a discussion about whether you draft for need or whether you draft the best player available. And it is a question about basically a black and white on-off, which of these options do you take? And I think as you see in the NFL draft, when you see teams trading, that shows that there is not a strict adherence to drafting the best player available. I think that it is a dangerous thing to do, because if you are only drafting the best player available, it may end up happening that you draft a player at the same position a bunch of different times in a draft, which doesn't make sense. At the same time, you see problems when you try reaching for a position of need rather than drafting the best available when you take someone like Christian Ponder very early in the first round. So when you come to a point when you maybe see players who are the best players available who you don't need, that is when you start seeing trades. Now, you may have misevaluated players who may be available. You may not have misevaluated players who are available. But there would be no reason for trades in the draft if teams stuck strictly to only drafting the best player available. Now, when it comes to actually grading individual draft trades, that is a different topic, I think, whether you made the appropriate decision, the best decision by trading out of a pick. That is a different topic, but I think in terms of draft philosophy, there is a mix of drafting for need, drafting best player available, and then trading out of a pick if neither of those two options serve your team as well as possible. So, having gone on that mini rant, moving down into the third round, further down, with the last pick in the third round in 2019, the Vikings drafted Alexander Mattison. I think this was a good draft pick. I think Mattison has served well as a backup. He has come in from time to time to be a starter when Dalvin Cook has been hurt. I am of the opinion that Alexander Mattison is not a person who I would want as the everyday starting running back for your team. There was a lot of discussion going through the last offseason up until Dalvin Cook signed his deal that it would be acceptable for Alexander Mattison to become the starting running back after last season. And I think part of the reason given was because people felt like Alexander Mattison could serve as a decent enough starting running back. My point during last season was that Dalvin Cook as a talent is head and shoulders above Alexander Mattison. That is more true from time to time. That is not consistently true, but it is worth saying that I think Dalvin Cook, on the vast majority of instances, is better than Alexander Mattison and is a more special talent. This is the point where now the separate argument is how much Dalvin Cook is being paid, and the acknowledgement that Alexander Mattison would be paid less than Dalvin Cook to be the starter. But I think just in terms of skill, in terms of what the player is able to provide for you, that is, on offense as a skill player, I would rather have Dalvin Cook than Alexander Mattison as your starter, but I do like having Mattison as your backup. So that said, moving down into the fourth round, we see here a very giant miss in a player by the name of Drew Samia, another offensive guard that the Vikings attempted to take here in the middle rounds. Drew Samia, we saw last season what happened with Drew Samia's lone start at guard. It went disastrously, and I think it's worth saying that even though Drew Samia remains on the roster, I would not expect to see him playing very often or hopefully at all for the Vikings this season. Further down the line, we see here in the fifth round, there was a trade here, I think, that I wanted to talk about. Was it this season or was it the season before? Did I miss it last season? Let's take a look here. No, it was this season. It was the Drew Samia pick. So, at the time, as we said, you were obviously looking for offensive line help, and you were looking for that to happen, I guess, with Drew Samia. You were also looking for defensive backfield depth. This player, who I'm going to talk about here, the reason I have as much of a connection with this person as I do is because he is an alumni from the same high school that I went to. He is much younger than me, but he went to my high school. A guy by the name of Amani Hooker. Amani Hooker was a safety coming out of Iowa, was drafted 2 picks after you took Drew Samia. And as it stands right now, I do believe Amani Hooker is going to be competing for a starting role this year down in Tennessee. Now, would Amani Hooker ultimately be a starting safety for you? Well, with the way it stands this season, maybe since you only have one solidified starting safety for yourself coming into the season. So, from a personal standpoint, it would have been cool for this person to be playing for the Vikings. I do wish the Vikings had taken Amani Hooker here rather than Drew Samia, especially since Samia has turned out to not have worked out for you. So now we move down to the 5th round, and we see the Vikings taking a player by the name of Cameron Smith, a linebacker. I'm going to be honest, I don't recognize this name either. There are times now going through this where I'm like, is it worth me actually doing a podcast about the Vikings with the number of players that I don't recognize? And I think I'm going to stand by the stance that this is more of an indictment of the Vikings than it is of my lack of recognition for these players and the names. And not recognizing them. But moving on into the 6th round, we see the Vikings have 3 out of 4 picks here clumped in the middle of the 6th round. Armon Watts, a defensive tackle, Marcus Epps, a safety, and Oli Udoh, an offensive tackle. 2 of these names, Watts and Epps, I think have served as decent enough depth for you, especially with where they were drafted in the 6th round. Oli Udoh has yet to really play at all. I guess in some of these garbage time Week 17 starts that he's gotten, he has been impressed enough for the Vikings to make mention of him in press conferences and whatnot. As it stands, we have yet to see whether Oli Udoh is someone who can actually compete to see regular playing time for you on the offensive line. So once again, the jury is still out for you on that player. Further down the list, Chris Boyd was a cornerback you drafted in the 7th round. Chris Boyd had some issues last season trying to play corner for you. Then we have more draft picks here. Dylan Mitchell, a wide receiver whose name I don't recognize, drafted in the 7th round. BC Johnson, a name I do recognize and who had a pretty good rookie season for you, and then disappeared with the introduction of Justin Jefferson last season. And then Austin Cutting, who you signed to be a long snapper and who played for you for a couple seasons and then who ended up being cut in the middle of last season after some issues happening with the specialists last season. So those are your picks. And then moving down into the undrafted free agents, we see a guy by the name of Corey Kari Blazingame, who was apparently picked up at some point by the Vikings, but who does not play for the Vikings, who now plays for the Tennessee Titans. So with all that said, with all those names that we've gone through, let's go ahead and take a look at the Vikings 2019 draftees. 1st round for the Vikings, they took Garrett Bradbury. 2nd round, Irv Smith Jr. 3rd round, Alexander Madison. 4th round, Drew Samia. 5th round, Cameron Smith. 6th round, Armon Watts, Marcus Epps, and Oli Udoh. And the 7th round, Chris Boyd, Dylan Mitchell, BC Johnson, and Austin Cutting. This draft, I guess you can say this draft is maybe better than the 2018 draft, just in terms of name recognition, just in terms of, at the very least, the amount of time that some of these players have seen in backup roles and their ability to remain with the team, I guess. As it stands, this is only 2 seasons ago, really, so we're still waiting to see how some of these players may develop, and we are still waiting to see whether someone like Garrett Bradbury ends up turning into more of a bust than a hit for you in the 1st round. So that has been the 2018 and 2019 NFL drafts. Go ahead and pull this off the screen. Come back to just my face for those of you watching on YouTube. Those of you listening on podcast players, as always, have just been listening to me the entire time. So if you've been enjoying that, thank you, or you're welcome, or something. If not, I apologize. But that's where we stand. Now, as it works out, as I said earlier in the show, we're now only 12 days away as we're recording from the draft happening down there in Cleveland, Ohio. It is actually going to be in person, or at least somewhat in person. We'll see how many people actually decide to attend the draft this season. But with this only being 12 days away, we now only have 1 episode left before we are going to be analyzing the results of this season's draft. So next week, I'm looking over the 2020 NFL draft, going back over last season's draft. That will be the final draft of the years we've been looking at, the last 10 years, and ultimately all of the Mike Zimmer and Rick Spielman drafts. And after we do that, I'm going to be looking through some of the different positions and seeing how well the Vikings address different needs, looking at how well they've been able to develop different players, and ultimately looking at what have been the Vikings' strengths in terms of drafting, what have been some of the weaknesses in terms of drafting, and then ultimately leading us up to, I guess, waiting to see what happens this season with the draft for the Vikings. So, with all of that said, this has been another episode of the Eric the Red podcast. My name still continues to be Eric Beck as I still try to figure out how to sign off of these things. For those of you watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. And for those of you listening, thank you for listening on your podcast players.